All right, welcome everybody. Welcome. Still people filing in. I think there's more room in the back there, but grateful to see all your all's faces today. So let's get this thing going. This is the Crossplane talk. My name is Jared. This is Nick. We are part of the leadership of the Crossplane project. We've dedicated a good chunk of our careers now to Crossplane. So we're obviously very excited to talk about something we're very passionate about. As is usual for KubeCons, we have a very diverse range of experience levels with Crossplane. So some people are running it in production. Some people have not even heard of Crossplane before, and they're curious about what it is. So we do have to start this talk with 10 minutes of basic introductory stuff. The more Crossplane pros might be a little bored with that, but I guarantee you the second half is going to be quite interesting as Nick is talking about the future of Crossplane, a V2 of Crossplane. Very exciting stuff you haven't seen. All right, let's go. So the basics. What is Crossplane? So we like to think of Crossplane as a cloud-native control plane. You basically use it to provision and manage all of your resources. You can take those resources, you compose them into higher level abstractions, and with those abstractions, you offer those to your developers so that they can self-service and provision and get the resources they need. Kubernetes is a great control plane for containers. Crossplane basically extends Kubernetes and teaches it how to manage everything else. Control planes are not a new concept, right? Cloud providers have been running control planes in their backends for years. But now Crossplane gives you the framework and the tooling that you need to build your own control plane, your own platform. So the basic building blocks here. We call these managed resources in Crossplane. So think about all the different cloud providers out there, all the different SaaS offerings, on-premises software, all that stuff. There's thousands and thousands of different resources and services out there. Crossplane aims to bring those into the Kubernetes control plane and allow you to provision and manage them from the control plane. In practice, what that looks like here with a little practical example is imagine an S3 bucket. So this S3 bucket here, Crossplane is representing it as an API object in the Kubernetes control plane. So just like any other API object, it's going to have a spec and some declarative configuration that you basically specify your desired state for this bucket, and then Crossplane will go take that desired state and apply it to the real world, ending up with an S3 bucket. Just like any well-behaved Kubernetes API object, they're going to have a status as well that's going to give you like the observed state of the real resource out there in the real world, the conditions. There's going to be events that tell the history of the life cycle, what's going on with that resource. So they're all these thousands of resources in Crossplane that are in the Kubernetes control plane are well-behaved Kubernetes API objects. How does this work? Probably like you expect. Imagine taking this bucket manifest as a user, and you apply this S3 bucket manifest to the control plane, to the API server, probably through GitOps or something like that. There is a set of controllers in Crossplane that are watching and actively reconciling these resources with the real world. So the S3 controller, it will get an event from the API server. It'll see that somebody has a desired state of a bucket. It'll use the Amazon API to talk to AWS and provision that bucket out there in the real world, matching the actual state with the desired state. So we've got the building blocks, the basic building blocks in Crossplane, these managed resources. Let's build them into an actual platform now. So the concept of composition is hugely important in Crossplane. Basically, it allows you to take these granular resources, assemble them, compose them into higher level abstractions, and then those abstractions are what you offer to your developers. So take, for example, if you want to compose together a GKE cluster, node pool, network, subnet, all that stuff, and then you want to offer that as a very simple cluster abstraction to your developers. You give them some limited configuration options, and they basically are then able to provision workload clusters that are, in accordance with your golden path of the platform team. And all that infrastructure complexity is hidden away from them. So it's a much easier experience to, unblock your developers and get them going quickly to production. All of this is, Kubernetes API, right? So any tool that knows Kubernetes can work with Crossplane and be compatible there. So let's do a little visual here. And spoiler alert, this will be changing a bit for V2 when Nick gets on the stage and shows you all that. But let's think about the middle of this diagram here. As a platform engineer, you need to define your platform API for your developers. So you specify the schema, the configuration knobs you want for them. What is this abstraction that you're exposing to your developers? Underneath the covers, you have to define a composition, the logic. What resources are you composing together, and how do you compose them together? In practice, let's look at this example here again of, say you as a platform engineer want to expose a platform API for databases to your developers. So you would go through the effort of defining the schema of that API. What are the configuration knobs I want to give my developers? And then your developer comes along, and you can see here on the left side of the screen that she's like, okay, I just want a small Postgres. That's all I want. The complexity underneath the covers is abstracted away and hidden in your platform there. So you're at runtime for this small Postgres. You have a GCP composition for it. Maybe you have Alibaba, maybe you have Azure, whatever. Maybe you have cheap or expensive. Maybe you have silver or gold. It doesn't matter. You could have any number of compositions that define this database abstraction. And then for the GCP case, that's going to be Cloud SQL, SQL user, global address connection, all that sort of stuff. So that's a bit of a practical look at it. Let's look at a little bit more details about how to do this. So to define the shape of your API, define your platform API, we have these, what they're called composite resource definitions. You basically define your custom API group. You're extending Kubernetes, right? You're giving Kubernetes a new API here, basically. And so you can define the API group, the kind, and then the schema. What are the configuration knobs that you want your developers to have exposed? And then you have to write the logic. What resources do you want to compose together? How do you want them to happen? And hugely important, the way we do that in Crossplane is by running a pipeline of functions. That's how you compose resources together in Crossplane. So let's talk about functions for a bit, because they're hugely important. So basically in Crossplane, you're running a pipeline of simple functions, and that's how you compose resources together. For all of those functions, you can basically use your language of choice. There's a whole plethora of different languages that are supported now, but the key part, the really important part here, is that you just need to focus on the unique logic for your platform. What does your platform need to do for your team? Focus on just codifying that, your golden paths, your configuration that's important to you. Let Crossplane do everything else, like managing the lifecycle of these things, doing all the heavy lifting, garbage collection, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. But you get to define a simple pipeline of functions. Now, when I say functions, you might think quickly of like, okay, I have to write code. That's not true. There's a whole ecosystem in Crossplane of these reusable functions that the community has built. And the key takeaway here is that all of these functions basically offer you a bunch of new experiences in Crossplane, a variety of ways that, to express your logic and build your platform. So there's a whole spectrum of, no code, declarative, low code, full code, whatever you're most comfortable with. Use that. They're not going to force you into one particular way of building your platform. Use the language that you're most comfortable with. Maybe that's a high-level config language. Maybe that's a lower-level general-purpose programming language. It doesn't matter. Use what you want, and then you're not stuck with just that only language. Each function in that pipeline could be whatever language you want. So you can mix them and match, build the platform in the way you're most comfortable with. So let's look at some examples. We're going to go through these quickly and not look at every line. But for example, with functions, you can do templating and define like a variable number of access keys. You can use Python to define this S3 bucket, if you like Python. You can use KCL to define like an EC2 instance for a variable number of regions. You can use Q to define some IAM policies for a given set of ARNs. You can use Pickle to make a config map, whatever. There's like a whole spectrum of experiences here. Or drop down to a lower level programming language, a general purpose programming language like Go. Then once you're if you want to define your platform and build your platform with a general purpose programming language, now you can start using like the native tools of that language and unit tests and test frameworks and linting and autocompletes, IntelliSense, language servers, all that stuff. Help you define your platform as a software project. It's up to you, basically. All right, so the last release in Crossplane was the 1.19. I think it was I was going to say last month, but now we're in early April, so it was actually February, I think. I almost lied to you, I'm sorry. But recently enough, 1 month ago, let's say. And so what we're focusing on there is continuing to mature Crossplane. The key APIs and features that folks are using and adopting in Crossplane, continue to mature those. So usage is now beta, the claim server-side apply is now beta, and then we also learned a mistake from one of our mistakes as well of how we promote APIs and doing that in a safe way so you can upgrade Crossplane and downgrade Crossplane as well across all the versions. We learned some mistakes from that and did a couple patch releases and have a good policy in place, so that works really well. And a couple of other things we worked on is basically making Crossplane more useful in more scenarios. So some host network scenarios that were in high demand from the community work now, being able to use private repositories with the Crossplane CLI, just making it generally more useful for people. And then last slide for me, next release. 1.20 is going to be in early May, so just about a month away. So roadmap for that and ongoing as well. So the changelogs feature in Crossplane, we've had it in runtime for a couple of releases, but we haven't actually rolled it out to the providers yet. And I think that's a really important feature because it basically lets you have like an audit log of everything Crossplane's doing to all of your resources, why it's doing it, when it's doing it, how it's doing it, where it's doing it, all that stuff. That'll be available in all the providers. So I think that's really important. We're obviously going to continue maturing the important features, the key feature areas and APIs that everyone's using and adopting. We're going to continue to mature those. We're going to work on insight, observability, metrics, like more insight into what Crossplane is doing. That'll be a theme. And then, of course, the future of Crossplane, Crossplane v2, which Nick will talk about.
Thanks, Jared. So Monday of this week, we released a preview build of Crossplane v2. So it's out there, it's released, and it's something that you can try now. Our goal with Crossplane v2 is to make Crossplane more useful for more things. We also want to make it more intuitive and less opinionated compared to Crossplane v1. There's 3 major changes in Crossplane v2. Composite resources are now namespaced, managed resources are now namespaced, and you can use composite resources to compose whatever you like, any Kubernetes resource, as opposed to only Crossplane resources. Over the last couple of years at KubeCon, something that while I was managing the Crossplane booth, something that I would frequently hear from people is, I love Crossplane for my infrastructure abstractions. I built cluster abstractions, database abstractions, etc. What should I use for my apps or my microservices, the things that actually are using that infrastructure? And it got me thinking, I was like, why not just use Crossplane? Or why not at least allow people to use Crossplane? So one of the themes with Crossplane v2 is it's better suited to building API abstractions for anything, not just infrastructure, and especially for applications or microservices. So composite resources, XRs, are now namespaced. Jared touched on XRs before, but as a quick recap, these are Kubernetes custom resources that when I say you, I'm typically meaning a platform engineer or something like that, is defining. So you teach Crossplane that this type exists, and you teach Crossplane what a schema is. Here I show an app, but it could be a billing front end, a web app, an Acme database. It's really entirely up to you. So in Crossplane v2, all XRs, all composite resources, and all managed resources were cluster scoped. There were reasons for this. It was inspired by persistent volume claims and persistent volumes in Kubernetes, and it kind of made sense when we were thinking about it as an infrastructure tool, arguably. But in this modern world, I don't think it makes sense anymore. So we've just made them namespaced. What this means is we've lost an entire concept in Crossplane. There are no claims in Crossplane v2. Claims were a namespace proxy. You would create a claim in your namespace, and then Crossplane would respond by creating a cluster scoped XR that was identical to the claim. No need to do that anymore, given that XRs can now be cluster scoped. Another small change that you might see here, if you're familiar with Crossplane, is on every XR, there's a couple of things that configure how Crossplane works. So the example on this YAML that you're looking at now is the composition reference. This is the part that tells Crossplane, hey, when someone creates this app, use this configuration to know what to do, to know what resources to create in response to this app being created. Previously, all of these sort of Crossplane machinery fields were just top level under spec, and this means that it would be easy for users to confuse stuff that was Crossplane machinery that they may not need to worry about with stuff that is actually important, like the image in this example, the image that the app's going to run. So we've moved all of these Crossplane machinery fields under spec.crossplane just to make it easy to say, hey, you can ignore all the Crossplane stuff under spec.crossplane if it's not relevant to you as a user. I should say most composite resources are now namespaced. When you saw the XRD example earlier, you'll notice it looks a lot like a Kubernetes CRD. custom resource definition, and we've taken the scope field that exists on CRDs and just put that on XRDs. So now you can choose whether your XRD is namespaced or cluster scoped. Well, you're choosing whether your XR is namespaced or cluster scoped using the XRD. So I expect that, like Kubernetes resources, the vast majority of XRs are going to be namespaced going forward, but there are some interesting use cases for cluster scoped XRs. So a namespaced XR can create resources in its namespace. A cluster scoped XR can create cluster scoped resources or resources in any namespace. So one thing I'm excited about with cluster scoped XRs is you could imagine packaging up something like Argo CD or an operator using an XR, building that API yourself, and then using that to roll out to clusters or control planes to deploy that. In V2, I mentioned before, managed resources are now namespaced. This one's pretty straightforward. Right now, as of the preview, we've only updated the AWS providers to have namespace managed resources. Over the next couple of months, we'll update all of the providers to support namespace managed resources. This means that when you're creating a namespaced XR, you can compose that XR of namespace managed resources. And I won't take too much time to explain the benefits of namespacing in Kubernetes. I presume that you're all familiar with it. It's a tenancy isolation, lets you give people access to create app XRs and maybe manage resources directly in one namespace, but not others if you want to. And that gets to another thing that's more of a philosophical change with Crossplane v2. In Crossplane v1, I thought of it as kind of vertically integrated, and what I mean by that is we told people you shouldn't really make managed resources directly. You shouldn't put managed resources in a Helm chart. You should create managed resources using a composite resource. And the opposite was also true. We said composite resources were for Crossplane managed resources, not for arbitrary Kubernetes resources. We no longer hold that opinion with Crossplane v2. With everything becoming namespaced, it makes a lot more sense to potentially create managed resources using another tool. If you want to, that's fine. I think it works best and great with composition, but you don't have to use composition. And similarly, you can use composition to compose whatever Kubernetes resources you want. Could be a deployment, could be a service, could be whatever you want, not just Crossplane managed resources. So let's show that now. Don't worry, this diagram that looks very complicated and weird is showing you how it used to work in Crossplane v1. So technically in Crossplane v1, you could already compose whatever resource you liked, but it was a little strange. So what we're showing here is this example where the platform team has defined a new API, and that API is an app. And so someone comes and they say, all right, cool, I'm creating an app in my namespace. And what the platform team has said is when someone creates an app, Crossplane, what I want you to do is create a deployment, a service, and an RDS instance. And you can see the machinery of how that works is the app claim gets created in the namespace, then Crossplane jumps out of the namespace to the cluster scope, creates an app XR, which is just a mirror of the claim. Then that app XR is composed of two objects for our Kubernetes provider, which is weird in and of itself, the Kubernetes provider for a service that runs on Kubernetes. Those cluster scoped object managed resources would then jump back into the namespace, create a deployment and a service, and meanwhile the RDS instance would be cluster scoped. So it gets the job done. Your user creates an app, and out the other end comes a deployment service and RDS instance, but it's more complicated than it needs to be. So here's what that looks like in Crossplane v2. I think you'll agree that there's like at least 3 boxes missing from this diagram. So it's a lot simpler. The user creates a namespaced XR, and Crossplane responds by directly creating a deployment, a service, and an RDS instance, also namespaced. And like I mentioned, you don't have to use managed resources at all. Here's the same thing. User creates an app, we create a deployment, a service, and a cloud-native PG database cluster running Postgres in the cluster, as opposed to running RDS or some cloud service. Crossplane v2 is backward compatible with Crossplane v1. What this means is once Crossplane v2 is GA, you'll be able to upgrade from v1 to v2, and most people shouldn't have any breaking changes doing that. There's 2 things we've done that enable this. One is, I mentioned before that XRDs have a namespace, have a scope field, and it can be namespaced or cluster scoped. Actually, it can be namespace cluster scoped or legacy cluster scoped. And if you set it to legacy cluster scoped, which will be the default for v1 of the XRD API, then it will just create a v1 style kind of legacy XR. So that XR will support claims. It will not use Spectre Crossplane. It'll work just like it works in Crossplane v1. We're also adding namespace managed resource support to all providers, but we're not removing cluster scoped managed resources. So in Crossplane v2, we'll consider v1 style cluster scoped XRs and v1 style cluster scope managed resources to be a legacy feature. We intend for you to migrate away from those and start using the namespace features, but you don't have to do that as a forcing function to upgrade to V2. You can install V2 and all of your V1 style stuff will still be supported. We did take advantage of the major version update to remove some features that have been deprecated for a couple of releases, most notably controller config, which is a way to configure our providers. It's been deprecated for like 11 releases, never actually made it out of alpha, but it was heavily used. So we finally pulled the band-aid there and said that's now gone in V2. And the other one that's been deprecated for 2, going on 3 releases is native patch and transform. This was the precursor to composition functions. So if you are using native patch and transform, you do need to switch to composition functions before upgrading to Crossplane V2. All right, now I'm going to do a quick demo of V2. I need to hand this microphone to Jared so it doesn't make a weird noise. All right. So for this demo, I'm just going to go through the get started composition guide that's in the new V2 docs for Crossplane. We actually did quite a lot of work revamping the V2 documentation. I hope that you can see this okay. It's about as big as I can make it. So we're going to stick with the same app composite resource example. Our goal here is we're going to create an app that looks like this. You can see it's only got one field in spec, the image. And when the app gets created, we want Crossplane to create a deployment and a service. No managed resources, nice and simple, just going to create a deployment and a service. The replicas are going to be copied from the deployment status, and the address in the app status is going to be copied from the services status. So we need to do 3 things to create this new type of XR, this new custom resource in Kubernetes. We need to define it, we need to install a function, and we need to configure how Crossplane calls that function. So first we define it by creating an XRD. Defines the schema and teaches Crossplane and Kubernetes that this app is the thing that exists. It's the XRD that we've got here. I'm going to jump around a lot now from these windows, I apologize. And I have this XRD here already, so I'm going to create that XRD. And just so you know, I'm not lying to you, that's the same XRD, I promise. Now that I've created this XRD, Kubernetes knows that app is a thing that exists, and Crossplane knows that app is a thing that exists. Crossplane knows it's responsible for app. It knows it should spin up a controller and start reconciling apps, but it has no idea what to do if you create one. If you create one of these right now, Crossplane's just going to be like, I don't have an implementation for this, I just know I own it. So next, we need to install a function that teaches Crossplane what to do. For the purposes of this guide, it's kind of more complicated, as Jared touched on before, but let's assume that a function is basically a pluggable configuration language that lets you pick what configuration language you want to use to configure Crossplane. We've got 4 in this guide. YAML's a bit boring, and I want you to pick what function I use. So why don't you let me know by show of hands, I'll ask for show of hands in a second. Would you like Helm-style templated YAML, Python, or KCL, which is a relatively new CNCF configuration language? All right, show of hands for Helm-style templated YAML. Cool. All right, show of hands for Python. It's good, I like Python, that's my favorite. Show of hands for KCL. Oh, I think KCL wins though. All right. What do you think, Jared?
It was pretty even, but go with KCL.
KCL it is. All right, so now we would install this function. I actually cheated because we're on conference Wi-Fi, and I will show you that I have actually installed all 4 of these functions already because Crossplane would actually have to download them, and I don't want it to fail to download them. What we have now is we've defined the app, and we've also installed the function that we're going to call, but now we kind of need to connect the 2 together. We need to tell Crossplane, okay, when someone creates an app, call this function with this input, so to know what to do. So we can jump back over here, and then go down to configure the composition. And I'll show you what these look like briefly. Templated YAML looks like a Helm chart. Python looks like Python. Quick note on Python, some languages actually support, you'll notice that this is like Python inside of a YAML document, which is convenient for small and simple cases like this, but it's pretty gross for more complicated things. You probably want syntax highlighting and completion and things like that. For Python, you can actually just like write a function in Python and use your IDE. So that's what I would do for a larger function, but this is great for something simple like this. And then finally, KCL, which is what we're going to run with. That's what KCL looks like. It's kind of a little bit Pythonic. So, apply composition KCL. Gonna make sure I don't have any other compositions there. Great, compositions there. That means Crossplane knows what to do now when you create an app. I've got an app here. There's the app, super simple. All right, so I've created that app. So now Crossplane is saying, okay, I've got this app. I'm going to look up what composition I need. So it's going to look up and find that there's only one composition. It's going to use the KCL one that we just created. And then it's going to call function KCL with the input from that composition. So let's see how that's going. All right, that's looking promising. Oh, it's actually done already, I think. So you can see here in these events that it's selected the KCL composition that we created before. And for a minute, the deployment and service weren't ready, but I can see that it is now synced and true. So synced is true and ready is true. So one of the cool things about this all being namespaced and just like more of a normal Kubernetes resource compared to Crossplane v1 is I can use the kubectl tree plugin on the app, and it'll show me that the app is true, and it'll show me the app's composed of a deployment and service and all the things that they entail. Thus ends the demo. This is all namespaced. Hey, that's the big change. Thank you. Oh, I want to come back over here. I'll come back over here. Crossplane v2 is available today. Jared and I spent a lot of effort on revamping the docs for Crossplane v2 as well. So if you follow this URL or open this QR code, which we will show later once we finish the talk, that'll take you to the docs. That'll teach you how to get started with Crossplane v2 as a preview. The reason it's the preview is the actual design is still open. We're still waiting to get more feedback from the community. We wanted to give you something concrete that you can install and kick the tires on and play around with, and let us know if this is the right direction before we commit to it as the real future of Crossplane v2. I feel pretty good about it personally, but I'm really excited to hear what you think. So definitely give us feedback on Crossplane v2 and give us feedback on the new documentation that we've put out. Now I'll give you back to Jared to wrap it up.
All right, let's close it up here. Thank you, Nick, for showing us off all that awesome V2 stuff. So, once again, like the Crossplane project is nothing without its community, right? So more contributors are always welcome. We did recently author like a getting started guide for new contributors. So if you go to the Crossplane GitHub repo, it's in the contributing folder right there, easy to find. There's a little QR code if you want to scan that too. But basically, it kind of helps you understand the lay of the land of where do we need contributions in Crossplane? How do you get started with your first contribution? How do you find a good first issue? All that sort of stuff. The docs definitely need help as well. So there's a lot of places to pitch in and help out. And this is kind of your guide to figure out where to get started and how to become a Crossplane contributor. And key takeaway from this slide, crossplane.io. Go to the website there. All these things are linked from there. You can find the docs, you can find our repos, blog, all that sort of stuff. So crossplane.io, that's where to go to find out other ways to get involved. And then final slide here, once again, V2. This is the call to action, folks. We showed you off all these changes that we think are really helpful to make Crossplane more useful, more easier to use. Lots of great stuff there. So try it out. We'd love to hear your feedback. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. Yep, I think we got 3 minutes for questions. So we will take anybody who has a question. Yes, I saw your hand first. I'll come running to you. Oh, you're faster than I am. Right on.
Hi, thanks. Does Crossplane has a mechanism for fetching data similar to Terraform's data?
In a way, it's got primitives you can use to do that. It doesn't have yet something that's exactly the same as Terraform data sources. We have two things you can use, though. We have what we call observe-only resources. So you can create a resource and Crossplane won't actually do anything in the cloud. It'll just mirror it back. And then on top of that, you can write functions that will then sort of load that up and sort of do interesting stuff with it. It's a common request to have something more like data sources, and we think we've got the primitives, and we're thinking about what we want to do to build something a little bit more convenient than saying you have to write a function to do it. So, kinda, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Oh, there's that one too. Oh.
Hi. Thanks for the praise. I've got a question. Is there a way to schedule the deployment of various resources, or want to deploy one resource prior to another one in Crossplane to schedule the order, like the deployment phases?
I think you were asking basically, can you order the updates or creations, right?
Right.
Yes, you can. So because composition functions are pretty open-ended, What Crossplane will do every time it calls a composition function, it'll say, here's the observed state of the world. So you asked me to create a deployment in a service. Every time it calls the function, it'll say, hey, I've made the service, but I'm still waiting on the deployment, for example. Which means it's pretty trivial to add logic to your function to basically say, hey, just don't create this service until the deployment's created or whatever sort of thing. So yes, you can, but you do need to. By default, it doesn't. By default, it'll just create everything. But because we give you a lot of power, it's relatively easy to do that. And there are certain existing opinionated functions that support configuration language that will kind of magically do that for you as well. But it's kind of on a function-by-function layer.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and then last question was right over here. If you're still here, Broden. Did you? Oh, there you are. Okay.
So, is there any way to increase the reconciliation loop interval so we won't get rate limited in some providers?
Yeah, to throttle it or to pause it or those sort of things?
Exactly.
Yeah, yes. There's a couple of configuration options that every provider exposes that basically allows you to specify how often you want to be syncing resources, or you can make them go slower basically. And then there's also the concept of a pause in Crossplane, where you can apply a pause annotation to resources and composite resources and stuff, and Crossplane will stop reconciling it entirely then until you unpause it.
Exactly what I need. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you for the talk.
Yeah. And that's when we're done.
Just a quick follow-up on that as well. There is another feature that is hopefully going to come out of alpha soon called real-time compositions. This is more at the composition layer, but something that can cause things to be reconciled more than you'd like is that at the composition layer, where every 30 or 60 seconds polling and just checking everything, we have an implementation that uses sort of watches or kind of like pub sub so that you don't need to be constantly polling. Long story short, when we get this to beta, there'll be fewer reconciles in the system, and that's a priority for the soon.
Cool. Yeah, awesome. So that's all the time we have. Thank you, everybody, once again. Come to the booth and hang out more.